On March 3, 1991, Rodney King, a black felon on parole, drove through the streets of Los Angeles County trying to evade police. When he was finally stopped, the intoxicated King was said to resist arrest. As a result, he was severely beaten by 4 white police officers. The beatings continued long after he was no longer in a position to resist. What these police officers did not know was that the whole incident was caught on videotape. All 4 cops were indicted on charges of assault with a deadly weapon and use of excessive force. More than a year later, on April 29, 1992, the jury that heard the case returned a not guilty verdict for all counts except for one, and that ended in a hung jury. Protests erupted into violence, and soon people were rioting across South Central Los Angeles as the results became known. Shortly afterwards, Reginald Denny, a white trucker, got stuck at the corner of Florence and Normandy. He was pulled from his vehicle and practically beaten half to death with fists, kicks, and bricks. Japanese-American Takoa Harada was also pulled from his car and beaten in the same intersection. Another traveler trapped in the midst of the rebellion was white reporter Jeff Kramer from the Boston Globe. He was beaten in his car and shot several times before he could escape. It was up to regular citizens to provide help to these men. The police were no help in these cases. They had quickly become ineffective and outnumbered against the looting, fighting, and arsons that overtook the city. Eventually, California Governor Pete Wilson deployed the National Guard and declared a curfew. When this proved to be unsuccessful in quelling the crowds, President Bush sent in the military and special riot-trained officers to get the city back under control. But for 3 days, chaos reigned in L.A. It was in this time that Rodney King made his famous impassioned plea, "Can we all get along?" By the time it was all said and done and the smoke had cleared, more than 60 people died and over 5,000 were arrested. Over 4,000 guns had been looted. About 1,400 buildings were damaged or destroyed, with 700 of those being businesses that were burned. More than $1 billion in property damages was done, and some 12,000 people lost jobs. Most of the damage was done in South Central Los Angeles. Research shows that the areas that were at least 40% Hispanic or 40% African American had the most fatalities and structure damage. This wasn't random because people are more likely to engage in riot activities closer to home. And home, to a lot of the black population in South Central, had become a changed place. This was particularly true in the areas that had experienced rapid in-migration of Asians and Hispanics into their well-established African American neighborhoods. This quick desegregation of the African American majority may be what led to ethnic violence and fatalities in the 1992 LA riots. This mixture of races with different cultures exacerbated issues in South Central. Resources were already scarce in the area. Lyndon Johnson's 1964 War on Poverty helped cut poverty rates nearly in half and provided food stamps, legal services, college tuition, prenatal care, medical care, and early childhood education through programs like WIC, Medicare, and Head Start. However, subsequent slashing by the Reagan and Bush administrations decimated the programs designed to assist the inner-city residents of Los Angeles. Urban areas saw federal aid drop by more than 50% between 1980 and 1992. The double hit of reductions in assistance programs and the deindustrialization of the area that took away the jobs led to a rise in crime in those neighborhoods. Gangs proliferated. Illicit drugs became a lucrative way to make a living. As crime became a way of life for many, heavy policing ensued in these areas, and the people who lived there were monitored very closely and picked up for even the most minor of infractions. The law and order policies that came from the Reagan and Bush administrations opened the door to arresting black men and just sending them to prison. Operation Hammer, started in 1987 by the LAPD, was a particularly hard example of these law and order procedures. It cracked down very heavily on black and Hispanic residents of Los Angeles. Raids by the LAPD under Operation Hammer had led to the arrest of some 50,000 people in 3 years, though few actually led to charges. The LAPD was almost certainly employing racial profiling tactics. Independent investigations into police activities in a 4-year span found that there were complaints of aggravated racism and many assault charges filed. Of the more than 1,400 cases filed in this time, less than 1% of police officers charged were actually fired, and penalties for those who were found guilty were very minor. It is worth noting that it was during this time that America began to see the shift that we see today in the composition of the prison population to an African American majority, though they only represent 13% of all Americans. Rather than trying to get help to figure out how to improve their situations in the neighborhoods, Young blacks were just being funneled to prisons. The influx of Asian immigrants did not feel like an improvement to the blacks living in the neighborhoods of South Central. The Asians moved in rapidly, and Koreans ended up running the majority of the grocery and convenience shops in the area. Many of them bought into the stereotype that African Americans were lazy and criminal. Coupling the almost cage-like lock the police had created around the neighborhood and the high crime rate, new Asian immigrants to the area had no trouble in believing the stereotypes to be true. As a result, they kept pretty much to themselves. They controlled the commerce, but they did not make much of an effort to blend in or foster merchant/customer relations within the existing black community. It did not help that the media that pitted them against the African Americans as well. Mainstream media has historically promoted the idea of the ideal Asian minority with its strong work ethic and self-sufficiency. When clashes came up in Los Angeles, media tended to side with the Koreans over the blacks. Black media, on the other hand, portrayed the Korean store owners in the area as exploiters and felt that they, along with the government, marginalized the black citizens. The factors of extreme inequality, media bias, and lack of civility led to a strong antipathy between blacks and Koreans. This simmering resentment and the ensuing collective violence between the two goes back to the confusion over the boundaries that separate the us from the them that Charles Tilly talked about in The Politics of Collective Violence. Neighborhood boundaries were very real in Los Angeles. So were boundaries between African Americans and Asians. When we think along the lines of who is with us and who is against us, whether the threat is real or not, the seeds of confusion, fear, and distrust get sown, especially when perceived boundaries are invaded. Things were already tense in Los Angeles due to the beating of Rodney King. They were made worse with the killing of Latasha Harlins, a 15-year-old African American, by a Korean shop owner that occurred 2 weeks after Rodney King's beating. Boycotts of Korean stores were called, and pressure built up under the surface. With the Rodney King verdict over a year later came the flashpoint for the anger harbored by blacks in South Central. The underlying resentments against the police and the Asians came to the forefront. Large-scale rioting and clashes erupted between blacks who lived in the neighborhoods, the police, and the Korean shop owners trying to protect their stores. But rioters in LA in 1992 were not just African American. Hispanics, and to a lesser point, whites also participated. This urban uprising resulted from a frustration of discriminatory practices, lack of economic success through legitimate means, and unfair policing that tended to target the minority populations. This specific targeting and constant monitoring of the minorities in these specific areas is dehumanizing, as Fanon said, and when the natives get restless and cause anxiety to the colonizer, or in this case, law enforcement, he is threatened with the ever-present chance of violence. This environment created a population that was a moving force that was ready for violence at all times. This readiness for native violence in the South Central inhabitants is what unified the people into civil unrest when the verdict was read. It led to the clashes with police and the Koreans and to the decimation of the area. It was not just Los Angeles that saw violent protests to the verdict. Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Seattle, Jersey City, and San Francisco were just a few of the other cities in the country that saw riotous behavior in the aftermath of the not guilty verdict. None of these, however, were to the extent of what Los Angeles saw. This is not to say that all protests to the Rodney King verdict were violent. Plenty of people took to the streets to voice peacefully their opinions on the outcome. However, the structural violence that was long institutionally embedded in South Central due to the factors of interethnic tensions, lack of economic opportunities, and oppression by the LAPD to minorities soon took over. Thanks to this pervading culture of criminality, efforts of peace soon gave way and anarchy reigned. Jack Katz referred to the events in LA in 1992 as anarchy instead of a riot or rebellion because it was a quick-moving, anti-establishment, anti-authority action in which all semblance of order had failed. It was a collective conscience that took over at a rapid pace. Those who gathered in mass and acted criminally knew they would be more likely to be visible to law enforcement and even media, but less vulnerable to being singled out by those authorities for their behaviors. Katz referred to this as an ironic epiphany of invisibility, which he says is the heart of collective anarchic behavior. It was this collective anarchic behavior that allowed the LA riot to take on the life that it did. The rioters of LA participated in criminal activities knowing that they would have safety in numbers to act in plain sight because the sheer volume of those who joined would protect the individual from prosecution. The media did not help. With news helicopters flying overhead and reporters on the ground, it was easy for the rest of the world to see what was taking place in LA. The rioting had actually accelerated right after a news helicopter broadcast live the Reginald Denny beating. It had become a real-life apocalypse happening in real time that exceeded anything one might see on the big screen. When those on the streets who were looting and vandalizing saw that their actions were being broadcast and that the police were powerless to stop them, it fueled their criminal behavior. How the police became powerless came from a combination of factors. They lost their broad authority to act on decisions and allocate resources due to the sheer number of the mobilized protesters. There was division regarding what steps to take, and that led to a lack of coherence and capacity. The new and overwhelming demands of the conditions at hand severely impacted the department's ability to focus on its core job. In other words, they lost control of the situation. When the National Guard and military moved in, the balance of power shifted back to the authorities. It was during this time of control and curfew that the facilitation of arrests occurred. 2017 marked the 25th anniversary of the LA riots. Since 1992, we have seen lesser riots occur in Charlotte, North Carolina, New York City, Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, to name a few. Yet nothing has come close to the riots of 1992 Los Angeles. Peaceful means have been used since then to protest a variety of issues that people hold as important to them. But until we can figure out some way to address all of the inequalities and social ills of the country, we can never truly discount the idea of another riot of the magnitude of LA 1992.